Hey everyone, I just wanted to make a few comments to close our discussion for Module 2. I apologize, this is little bit late. Um, I just got back from Salt Lake at the end of last week and have been getting back into things this week. I'm really impressed with the level of work that you all contributed to the discussion. Even though we're very few in numbers, I think that we will have a strong class over the next few weeks. So I'm very excited about that. So thanks for all your hard work. Pat yourselves on the back. I really enjoyed the conversations that we were having about borderlands and what the study of borders kind of means for the field of history. So we were looking at articles that outlined the historiography of borderlands history. As we read about, typically Frederick Jackson Turner, Herbert Eugene Bolton, they're kind of the founding fathers, respectively, of American Western history and the idea of borderlands history. And so the various articles that we read harkened back to them, also critiqued some of their ideas. A couple of articles that were also mentioned in several of the others were the ones written by Edelman and Aaron and Van Schendel and Bod, or Bod and Van Schendel. And so I added those to the module as optional readings if you got the chance. I noticed that William made some comments on Bod and Van Schendel. They did a very good job of kind of outlining the complex nature of borderlands, which is something that Peter Solons, who wrote a famous book in the field on the history of France and Spain and the Pyrenees, also did. So helping us see that there are a lot of different directions that contact can take in a border zone, especially as those borders become defined by empires and nation states. So that's kind of one of the central problems of borderlands history that it's trying to explore and get through, is this issue that we've all been sort of siloed into national histories within the profession of history, at least academically. And of course, as you take courses, you've probably noticed this as well. You take a class on Mexican history, you take a class on US history. There are some kind of topical classes, but usually they focus on kind of looking deeper into one of those national stories. And so what Borderlands history has tried to do is create that epic of Greater America, at least in the case of those who are working after Bolton and those who are working on the borderlands of North America in the Western Hemisphere. Borderlands approaches, as we read, but didn't really, we sort of read about, but didn't read, have gone beyond the Americas as well. There are a lot of historians of Africa and Europe and Asia, among other places, that are also doing work on border regions in those areas. So there's becoming the possibility of doing some interesting comparative work with those secondary studies that have been done. Hopefully you'll get to teach a class in the not too distant future that does a more broad comparison of borderlands, not just looking at North America. Something though that Hamalainen and Truitt kind of pointed to in their State of the Field essay that we read, and if I'm not mistaken, thinking I have these things sort of scattered around me here, but I believe that was the most recent of the different readings that we did. It was published in 2011 in the Journal of American History. And so they were making a call for scholars to try to unite the narratives of Borderlands history into a kind of broader field of Borderlands history. So kind of pointing toward the idea that maybe there could be a unified Borderlands history textbook. That thing hasn't happened yet. Some, like Brian DeLay, have edited some volumes on the history of North American borderlands, for example, that put together a few different essays, kind of the same way that Johnson and Graybill do, the book that we're using for class. So beyond that kind of comparison, there hasn't really been an effort to weave all of those together. The Hoarder article that we didn't really discuss in too much detail, I know, William, you had that one and you mentioned it in your comments. That's a volume on North American migrations, but an essay in there that I'll probably have to scan and show to you all approaches the topic or the question of, could we do a history of North America more broadly, and how would that change the turning points that we look at? So rather than having kind of the Civil War at the center, we might have a turning point where Canada got its kind of dominion status apart from Great Britain, for example, among many other things. Of course, so each national history has its own turning points. The regions have their own turning points. And so just to kind of put all of this together as we move forward, I think it's important to realize, again, the complexity, the messiness of border regions, that there are often multiple and varied groups of people, whether ethnically or culturally or religiously or whatever it might be, who are coming together in these zones of contact and conflict. So themes of contact, conflict, and accommodation are really hallmarks of border studies. As we talked about briefly in our discussion, the idea behind borderland studies, at least initially, from a lot of scholars' perspectives, was to try to find what are the things that unify people across borders. And I think that's an important line of questioning to take. But at the same time, there was sort of just an implicit recognition that the people have always been divided by borders as well. Borders can be violent, but that violence hasn't been studied in great detail until recently. Something that I found with my own work is that violence can also, it's not just a destructive force, although it certainly is that, but it does create the terms for the kinds of communities in border regions that kind of develop after that. Something else that I think might make difficult the call that Truitt and Hämäläinen were making is the idea that there are many regions in borderlands, and there are many regions in the United States. So U.S. history, of course, has also focused on different regions: the West, the South, the Northeast, the Midwest. They all have their own historical associations and things like this. And so it's, again, sort of a difficult balancing act that maybe as borderlands scholars we haven't quite reached yet, to try to tell the story of borderlands history in the Americas, as well as looking at those individual pieces of the border region. How is the region between New Mexico and Chihuahua different from the region between Baja and Alta California, for example, at any given moment? And there are differences. Those are important things to really take into account as we study borders. I know that Donna mentioned David Chang's article. She had that one, and she did a good job of kind of getting us to look into that one a little bit. To maybe push us to discuss it in a little more detail, I wanted to offer some extra credit. So for up to 2 points extra credit, just to add on to this discussion. Just write a brief paragraph to comment on David Chang's approach, because I think he's doing something slightly different, certainly doing something different than those state of the field articles and approaches that we read from Truitt and Young and from Hämäläinen and Truitt. And so, let's see, I'm trying to find the comments that I made here. Right, so how does Chang's approach add to and complement and complicate our idea of borderlands? Because he's not necessarily looking at borderland regions. He's not looking just at the spaces where two nations butt up against each other, but instead he's looking at themes of migration and what he calls restrictive border making in the 19th century, to see how that plays out on the lives of people from different nations and ethnic groups as they come to various points in the United States, mostly in the West. So, again, how does his work kind of complicate what we were thinking about with what borderlands history is? And again, just add this to the Module 2 discussion thread if you'd like to earn that extra credit. Finally, as you probably noticed, I studied with Sam Truitt at the University of New Mexico. And so he's done a lot of leading work in the field of borderlands history. He and Elliot Young wrote that introduction to Continental Crossroads that we read. That was published in 2004, and it was sort of the guidepost for where borderland studies were going in the 2000s, in this new millennium. That was really when it became, meaning Borderlands history as a field, became kind of a big and important thing in the academic field of history, because so many people were kind of working across borders. And that's something that Lara Putnam reminds us of in her article. And we mentioned it seemed like maybe that one seemed out there in relation to the rest, but she did a good job of helping us to think about how a lot of history has become border history in certain ways because we're so able to access documents that have been digitized. And I think that there is something to be said about her argument that scholars still need to experience the places that they're writing about, that history should be grounded in place. And if you haven't been there, there's something missing to your ability to analyze the history of a place, even if you've done a lot of academic studies and read a lot. There's something that you just can't get from only reading. You have to also go and be there as well, interact with people who live there now, and so on. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of promise and hope for expanding our ability to do the kinds of work that Truett and Hamalainen were talking about, because we have more ready access to documents from wherever we're at. We don't have to go on 10 research trips a year to try to write the histories that we're conceptualizing in the field. So I think this may be the more rambling, hopefully, of these videos that I make. I don't usually mean to make them this long. So thank you for watching. Thanks for your participation. Please ask questions whenever you have them. I've been reading Rebecca Yeager this week with you as well, and I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation on Twitter about her work and toward reading your blog posts.